How's everyone doing today?
Great.
Good.
Cool. Yes, thank you for being here today, and of course, thank you to the audience for coming. So I guess let's dive right in. What impact has remote work really had on kind of spurring these new markets, but also further maturing, like already existing emerging ones? Mike, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think it's been interesting. I think coming, based in Chicago and investing in companies, primarily in the Midwest region, we've seen a lot of new exposure to companies just based on life over Zoom, right? I think a lot of investors, whether it's someone in your backyard or someone who's 1,000 miles away, having that proximity to speak to companies and invest in companies has been really interesting for those markets. And obviously for the employees as well, it's been exciting to see different folks come in and out of the ecosystem that normally would have been stuck in a different place.
Do either of you have thoughts?
Yeah, I would just add that, I think even before COVID, there was a trend of, the main coastal cities not being where all the venture capital was going to get invested. I think you had a lot of emerging markets, both in the United States as well as internationally, that were starting to attract a lot of different pockets of VC. And obviously COVID and remote work just accelerated that, where more and more companies, it's acceptable and expected that whether they're founded maybe in one of the coastal cities in some cases, that you have your workers sort of fully distributed. So I think it opens up the opportunity far more than the case, say 10 years ago. One quick comment I just add is, I think we're starting after 2 or 3 years of heavy remote work, starting to see some of the cultural issues creep in if you're not intentional about how one designs it, of how do you deal with conflict, how do you deal with change in direction when everyone's remote. So that's something we can maybe talk about.
No, that's so interesting. I mean, what type of cultural issues are you seeing?
Well, look, when everything is sort of up and to the right, it's sort of, I think, much easier to scale, and you can get resources from around the world, around the country, and it's a really productive way to work. But if you need to change direction and maybe your core value proposition has to shift, I think it's a little bit harder to get alignment when everyone's in a different time zone. And so I think, look, in this economy, we all can see the stock market, we can all see the change in environment. I think you're seeing that across a lot of different, companies.
Do you have anything you wanted to add?
I think the pandemic really forced a lot of teams to be able to work well remotely. And so I think part of that is still here to stay, because everybody, even if they were all in the same place, were forced to actually do it. And then I think a sort of second order effect is then because people were forced to do that, then they thought, okay, well, maybe I can just hire people in other places. And I think that trend is here to stay. If we look at our own portfolio, when people submit their applications to apply for funding at Hustle Fund, like for a long time, we didn't have remote as a geography, but people started writing that in. And that I think that is here to stay, at least with startups. Certainly for cost of living, if people are used to it and have a workflow, then it makes total sense.
Do you feel like it's gotten easier for founders or even as investors to raise money in a non-traditional tech hub?
I think so, certainly. I mean, like I said, I think, historically, if you weren't in San Francisco, if you weren't in New York, it was inherently harder to get attention, to have meetings, for investors to really want to buy in. I mean, as an investor, as a lead investor that takes a board seat, frankly, there is something around the reality of being able to actually spend significant time and work with a company that makes it more attractive when they are in your own backyard. That I think is fair to say. That said, when again there's no, proximity effectively became obsolete based on Zoom and that environment, and so it definitely became easier. I can point to Chicago as an example. Chicago, which I would say has been a maturing market for a long time, the pandemic and the remote work kind of accelerated an existing trend in that there were some very fundable companies, some very exciting companies there. And while 2021 was a remarkable year across the board for venture and startups, Chicago actually more than doubled its unicorns minted in that year alone, which I think is an indicator of what it meant for those companies getting attention and being able to raise venture.
I think if we were to graph this, I'd say in 2021 it did get easier, but as perhaps many of you have seen, I think now that we've gotten into the fall of 2022, the markets all around are fairly tight. And I actually think for international companies in particular, it's even harder than for US companies. just because when there is more scarcity of funding and US investors are trying to decide, okay, am I investing in a US company or abroad, they tend to favor more local for whatever reason.
I just think, there's going to be sort of a sine wave up and down depending on how much capital is flowing into the market at any point. But I think the long-term trend is clear. And I think it's because in our industry, you've seen very big, multi-decacorn businesses get built in, Helsinki and Sydney and Stockholm and, as well as Chicago and as well as Atlanta, as well as Austin. And I think we're all capitalists. I think you try to chase where the opportunity is. And the talent is no longer concentrated in these couple of coastal cities. So I think the long-term trend is going to be really positive for the non-traditional cities.
And before we dive into the international markets, what are some places and cities and markets that you're looking at nationally right now that are emerging? Mike, you first.
Yeah, well, selfishly, I would point back to Chicago. No, it's a great market. I think we look at, and again, M25, we focus on the Midwest region at the earliest stage. And so we look at Chicago as effectively the capital of the Midwest, if that makes sense. And, I think Chicago is mature enough that there's some real activity and some real opportunity there, but it's also early enough that we can still kind of define who we want to be as a tech ecosystem. Chicago is one of the most diverse economies in the country, if not the most diverse economy in the country. It's a massive city, and it funds diverse individuals at a higher rate than I think any other city in the country, especially women-founded companies. So I think there's a lot to love about Chicago. I'd also point to ecosystems like Indianapolis and Columbus and Minneapolis as some really interesting Midwest ecosystems to take a look at.
What about you?
I would just say, well, first of all, I think we've all read the TechCrunch articles on Miami or Austin, and there's a lot of great activity happening in LA. Seattle has always been a hub for sort of historical Amazon and Microsoft reasons. But if I could just make a comment to say, I think it really helps a lot from a sustainability perspective to be close to a technical university that has an ongoing supply of software talent, at least for what we do, which tends to be software internet primarily. I think there are certain markets, and I think Miami is one of them, where I just don't know if there's enough technical talent to scale it beyond what it is, at least so far. I think if you are operating purely on a remote basis and your engineering is distributed, maybe that's fine, but I just don't know where the critical mass of software talent is coming to help build companies if you're trying to do it in that one market. So I would just say there's a limit to some of these markets depending on how much technical talent that's showing up.
No, that's very. Sorry, can I?
Oh, go ahead.
No, sorry. I just wanted to say one thing, and that's really interesting. So how is that need addressed? Would you fund more technical programs within the universities and the school system? How would you, make all that talent so that Miami could stay as a big tech hub?
Well, I think those are things that are medium run and long run effects, right? So it's not a comment that one couldn't be incredibly successful in South Bend or in a smaller market, but I think if I look at say Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, for example, that has incredible, I think, as everyone knows, CS and ML and AI talent. So I just think it's just on the margin slightly more, there's a better chance of attracting more capital because of that critical mass of talent. Again, I'm saying it's possible, I think, to succeed in any number of places. I just think there's some limit that one reaches if you don't have that ongoing flow of talent.
I would sort of take the counter to this, actually. Because I think that actually for most software ideas these days, the tech is not rocket science. Certainly I would say there are some ideas that are, in which case that tech talent really matters. But for 80% of the things that we are investing in, I would not say that you need necessarily that level of talent. And what you do need is you need product market fit. And so what I am seeing is actually companies, take one of our portfolio companies, Copy AI, for example, which publicly announced, I think last week, that they are at 10 million ARR after 2 years. They are fully remote, mostly in the US. The founders are in, relatively in suburbs of towns in the US. And so I think this is an example of That is possible if you have product market fit. I think the challenge is getting to product market fit, and sometimes being co-located helps you get quicker reps and experiments because it's easier to coordinate as a team. But I do believe that once you hit product market fit, then actually location doesn't really matter so much.
I agree with that. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
But kind of on that note, how important is it that venture opportunities do spread throughout the nation and also touching these founders that are in untapped or in now untapped markets, but emerging markets? How important is it that these opportunities spread in terms of the future of innovation? Would you like to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I think, so prior to M25, I started an incubator and helped build companies. I was a first employee of a venture-backed company, and I, more to this question, worked for the Purdue Research Foundation, helping them market and license intellectual property, build companies based in the IP Community University. But at Purdue in West Lafayette, Indiana, I think there's a desire for that ecosystem to thrive, and there's things that the local stakeholders can do. An example, in the Midwest, a lot of states have kind of economic development type programs that will actually help spur innovation where that's not quite as needed in states like California or cities like San Francisco. And so as a venture capitalist, I think it's a really exciting opportunity to believe that we can have innovation spread across the country because you can have an advantage. There's different areas where you can form an advantage and have proprietary access to deal flow if you do the work and canvas appropriately. But also at the same time, I think it's the cities and the local ecosystems that the onus is on them really to do the right things, to create the right business environment, the type of living environment and the attraction to help kind of make it desirable to build a company in these places, which I think a lot of places are doing it well.
I think what is needed for a particular ecosystem is capital and also mentorship. And I think that everyone debates why did Silicon Valley do so well for so long and all this stuff. But I think it is those two things. One of the things you do see about the city is when people come to some level of wealth, it doesn't even have to be a lot, you see them running around writing angel checks, even $1,000 angel checks. And they provide advice on, this is what good UX looks like and things like that. I think now in this next inning, as we think about startups elsewhere, those are the two things that have always been a challenge in many other cities. But what I am very hopeful for is with the internet, actually you can get a lot of those two things now through other people online. And that's, I think, the bigger thing that I'm more interested in. I do agree there are certainly local initiatives in some cities in the US and even in other countries like Canada is very proactive on that. But I think getting that online is the piece to unlock if you're not in a New York or Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I just add is I think it's very important, to directly answer your question on. And I think it's not necessarily driven from a capitalistic incentive perspective, but just from a social perspective, I think it's really important because there was a period of time where it felt like, whether it was the VCs themselves, just the way the industry was structured, it seemed like every talented person had to move to, one or two or three cities on the coast, and I think that's just not a healthy way for, frankly, a society to develop. So I think it's it's a really positive thing, and it's a really important thing that there are these pockets of innovation that are not just in these two or three main cities.
I would love to know all of your thoughts on if there are still specific places like the Bay Area that are better for certain types of companies in terms of where is it best for a company to look for a pre-seed or a seed round, and how does that compare to maybe someone looking for a later stage round? Where should early stage companies go versus later stage? Elizabeth?
I think for pre-seed and seed, it does not matter because a lot of those things you can get online. But I think as you start to scale in Series A and beyond, that's when it may matter because a lot of institutional investors still want you to, generally speaking, be co-located in a location, still generally investing in their backyard-ish, certainly going out, but a little bit more so there. And then also from a scalability, advice, and talent perspective, there are not that many places in the world that have unicorn companies. So the number of people who have built a billion-dollar business before is still limited to certain places. That is starting to change. But I think, while everybody can read about lean startup and get angel investors online, you cannot get the same equivalent for Series B level advice, talent, money. And so I think for that, you do need maybe a headquarters or a main office or whatever in a major city. Most ideal is probably still Silicon Valley, New York, someplace like that.
I would just add that I don't think it maps by stage. I think it, maybe to Elizabeth's earlier comment of, look, I think a lot of it's about mentorship and about how quickly you can learn. And so there are certain pockets of talent where you can learn more quickly than if you're sort of fully distributed. To use the Pittsburgh example again, I think, autonomous vehicles, there was a certain critical mass of researchers and talent. And so I think if you were really trying to innovate, something on the leading edge of that type of technology, it's helpful to be around the other people that are in the cutting edge of innovation. So I think it's really where you get good mentorship and feedback so you can learn more quickly. I don't think it means that Austin or San Francisco or wherever is better at one stage or the other, at least as one opinion.
Mike, did you have anything to add?
Just quickly, I think, to both points just made, I mean, going to geography to raise a pre-seed round, I think that hopefully those days are not here anymore. I think you can raise a pre-seed pretty much anywhere, especially if you're active online, networking, making sure to be intentional about the types of investors you're reaching out to. I think really optimizing your location should be around the industries you're focused on, the expertise in that ecosystem, and that should be where you choose to help your company.
And so how does it also work for women and minorities? Is it good for them to kind of take the chance and still be in the non-traditional emerging hubs, or is it worth going to the Bay Area or New York City to look for funding for companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I'd answer the question the same way. I think you'd still want to target your investors appropriately. I think like anything, if you're building a cybersecurity company, you probably want to speak to investors that have a propensity to invest in cybersecurity. I think you can also probably look and see which investors have a propensity for investing in women and minorities and diverse founders, and target them. At least as far as we're concerned, we put out our diversity report earlier this year. We're not asking women or minorities or anybody to be in Chicago for us to invest in them. We do have a bit more of a geographic focus than most firms, but I don't think that should be the reason why. Now, if it's a question of who you want to network with and who you want to do business with and that sort of thing, I think there are opportunities to, again, on the more social side, to choose where you want to be and where you want to work, live. But as far as raising capital, I think it's similar.
Yeah, I think I have the similar answer. Similar to what I said a moment ago, I think it's where you get the best mentorship. And so I think it's not specific to a location, regardless of one's background or heritage.
I think we've all certainly seen the abysmal stats of funding for women and minorities, even more recently this year. But I think from an individual perspective, if you're thinking about raising capital for your company, because you can actually raise online, at least you don't have as much, I guess, capital cost out the door in trying to pitch all these VCs as you may have had 5 years ago. And so I think for women and minorities who have historically had a much harder time raising money, I think in that sense, it is a tinge better. Certainly the stats are still abysmal, but a tinge better in terms of finding investors. You can find them on Twitter. We're certainly very active, and you can rattle off a whole slew of emerging managers who are all very active. We all take pitches online these days through Zoom. You don't have to hop on planes anymore like you used to. And so I think in that regard, you can make sure at least that you are not entirely out of pocket, in the earliest stages at least, and then kind of go from there after you get some level of footing.
And to hone in on social media, what are some ways that perhaps founders in this audience can utilize social media, Twitter, TikTok, to really build those relationships and networks with the venture and startup community? Elizabeth?
Yeah, you may see all these investors on Twitter, and it's actually kind of for a good reason. It's not like we're just wasting time on Twitter, although it may seem like that. Because one of the things we noticed a couple of years ago in looking at our own analytics is that actually most of our deals were coming through a Twitter touch point. And at the time, we were actually not that active on Twitter. We were like, why are all these people finding us on Twitter? And so then we just doubled down on that and went crazy. All these other investors found the same thing. And so I think you really do actually have that critical mass. So I think as a founder then, how do you use that to your advantage? I mean, what I would do is like, just get yourself out there. Like, don't be afraid to talk about what is the problem you're solving on Twitter? Like, why are you doing it? Like, you know, any updates. I don't think you necessarily have to share every little detail about the conflicts you have or, you know, even necessarily what revenue you're doing, but like just put yourself out there. It's free and people will notice you. And I think actually if I look at my own portfolio, my companies who are active on Twitter actually do have an easier time raising money because investors feel like they know them from Twitter, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but you know, like many of us only just met for the first time in person, but we feel like we know each other super well because of Twitter.
How do you guys use Twitter?
Maybe not as much, maybe. Look, I mean, I think that the right comment is about, you know, the nature of whether raising money or recruiting or, you know, finding customers does require you to be out there, requires you to be open to networking and in the ecosystem. I think there's a question of how much time to spend on it versus sort of other areas of focus. You know, I think it depends sort of what sector and what type of company you're building, but I think, you know, maybe I might invest more of my time to sort of find the most important networks and influential people in a space that might not necessarily be through a social media strategy. So I would say, you know, I think it's just like going out and meeting people in person. I think it's an important technique. I would spend some time on it, but I wouldn't over-focus on it versus maybe some of the other aspects of, you know, finding product market fit or finding the other most influential people in a space.
Yeah, for me, I think it's about, I like to ask interesting questions and I like to engage with people that ask me interesting questions. And so if Twitter can be a platform for that to occur, then I think that's a really awesome experience. Personally, in 2020, especially after the murder of George Floyd, I did a lot of writing. That was really more actually kind of just writing about being a human and less about venture capital. And there were some overlaps, but actually not that much. And, you know, similar to Elizabeth's point, I feel like a lot of founders actually got to know me better because of just the things I was thinking a lot about that I thought were important to kind of, you know, put my heart on digital paper, so to speak, about. And, you know, that's led to some really great relationships with founders that have manifested into great investments and great companies as well.
And before I jump into audience questions, I just have two more. So we spoke a little bit about the international market. What are some specific regions and areas that you are all looking at right now that excite you?
In international?
Yeah, internationally.
Yeah, so we do a lot of international investing at Hustle Fund, and I am so bullish on that because I think in a nutshell, frankly speaking, in the US, I don't want to say everything is solved, but there are a lot of things that generally work in the US. If you go to another market, like there's just greenfield opportunity everywhere. There are countries where people still move literally bags of cash around to pay for things, let alone no credit, no loans, et cetera. And then, you know, some of the tools that we take for granted here around in B2B or even consumer apps, you don't find in a number of countries. So I think it is sort of the prime time in many other countries where there is strong mobile penetration, and in fact, actually maybe even much higher mobile usage than here in the US. And so if you have not even necessarily any connection to other countries, but if you have an adventurous spirit and you want to build a company, I actually think, you know, one of the biggest problems in building a company is getting product market fit. And a big part of it is how easy and cheap is it to get customers. And if you go to a market where it's way less competitive, you know, when I look at some of our emerging market companies, like that is not their problem. Their problem is finding talent to build their team, you know, things more around the company building rather than the customer acquisition. My companies in the US generally have more of the problem of getting customers rather than the team building. So which would you rather have? Actually, frankly speaking, having been an entrepreneur before, I think customer acquisition is really, really hard, and that's the problem I would prefer not to have.
And to follow up with that, how do you get your founders, you know, your founders that are located internationally, how do you get them to trust you as a US-based investor? Like, how does that relationship work?
I think I think more broadly, how do you get anybody to trust you? That's a good question, and I think partly because of our Twitter, we put out, we are our legit selves on Twitter, so all the wonkiness you see out there is actually what you get, and so that is one way, but I think the other thing is just in building the relationship over time as well, like we are former founders ourselves, so we try to move quickly, we try to actually make a decision within 48 hours of meeting you. We will do it over Zoom or any other video conferencing platform. So we try to, just kind of signal in a very authentic way like what we are all about, and ultimately that's how we try to build trust with all of our founders, whether they're in the US or abroad, because it can be done virtually.
I would just say when we sort of look back at greatest hits or things that worked out, you look at these companies that you may think of as being Bay Area, but they originally were started elsewhere. So Slack, for example, was started in Vancouver. Atlassian Software was in Sydney, still is in Sydney. Spotify was Stockholm, Supercell was Helsinki, UiPath is Bucharest. And so I'd say, in some ways, we're not specific that it's just this one market or another, but we believe if you can find sort of the national champion or the top 5 companies in any number of these countries around the world, they have the chance to be, really, really valuable businesses, sort of like the ones I just mentioned. A recent example for me is we recently invested in a company called Instabug in Cairo, Egypt. We weren't looking to invest in Cairo, Egypt per se, but it turned out to be an area of technology and product we really believed in, and we really believed in these 2 really scrappy, hungry founders from Cairo. And so I don't think it's a geographic specific strategy. It's just trying to find, as I say, sort of the national champion or the top 3, top 5 in many cities around the world.
Did you have anything to add quickly?
Unfortunately, no. We are middle of the U.S.
Focused.
Focused. Okay. So I'm going to ask some audience questions now. Someone wants to know, how do you gain momentum in your fundraise as a first-time fundraiser not in a major hub? Who wants to go?
Sorry, the question is how do you
gain momentum in your fundraise as a first-time fundraiser? I'm assuming they're like a founder looking to fundraise or maybe first-time fund manager, but they're not in a major hub.
I think the strategy is the same whether you're in a major hub or not, especially since a lot of investors will do at least first meetings over the phone or a video conference. And so I think, ultimately, raising money is about urgency and momentum. So you need to kind of get a lot of investor meetings on your calendar around the same time to create that. And ultimately, you are generating that urgency because of your meetings, not necessarily because of any commits you may have. But you can legit say, I'm meeting with 20 investors this week. And I think actually because people are willing to do meetings online these days, in some sense it's a little bit easier to pack in, say, 20 meetings into a week because you can have those meetings with people literally anywhere. So I think then working backwards, you want to create a strategy to, all right, figure out how can you get these meetings to all line up. But that is the general idea, like whether it's doing lead gen off of Twitter or getting referrals from your accelerator program or from your friend who's started a company and has investors, whatever it is, like you want to line up all your meetings so that way you are ready to go and do meeting after meeting after meeting, and then you want to move all your investors along at the same pace. Like, oh, I'm going into a second meeting next week, and then you tell everybody that and to kind of move everybody along.
My suggestion is maybe my comment about sort of finding the expert in a space. I mean, when you're on the investor side of the table, there's a lot of meetings coming at you. There's lots of conversations. You have to obviously sort out which ones you really want to follow up on and ultimately invest in out of sort of all the activity that's happening. And so oftentimes you'll call somebody who's in the family, maybe a former founder or a CTO at one of the existing portfolio companies who is the expert in a certain space. So if you are the new founder of a new company, if you can find a way to get to that expert first and have them vouch for you, even before you go out to fundraise, at least of your technical ability or of the sophistication of your ideas, even if you don't have metrics yet, I think that's a very powerful way to start fundraising. To use the example of that, Cairo, Egypt company, it turns out they first got to one of our previous founders of a company called Cloudera, and that founder, Amr Awadallah, invested in it as an angel. And so, I've never been to Cairo before. When it came time to evaluate whether or not they were capable and what their depth of sophistication was, it was very helpful to be able to talk to someone that we trusted already. So finding that expert, finding that sort of social proof, I think is a really good way to start.
Yeah, adding to Rich's point, I mean, I think we get actually a significant amount of our deal flow through the founders we've invested in. So we've invested in well over 100 companies in a region that's largely underserved, and in most cities that we've invested in, raising a pre-seed or seed round still makes you one of the not so many founders that have raised venture capital. And so, as a founder, especially as a CEO, whether you like it or not, you are always fundraising, whether you believe it or not. You're just either doing a good job of it or a bad job of it. And I think in the earliest days, proactively reaching out to founders that have raised venture capital, ideally from investors that you're looking to raise from, or in a similar industry, or whatever thread line of affinity you can find, building that kind of relationship for advice or to other purposes. When you do go out and raise, and ask them to pass you along, or if they had advice for who you should raise from. When I get a note from one of my founders that says, by the way, the founder that I've invested in, who I think is obviously super special, when I get a note from them saying, hey, you should check out this company, or hey, I heard you're talking to this company, by the way, I've known them for 6 months or 18 months or whatever, that's a good way to kind of build up momentum and to Rich's point, kind of elevate the signal within the noise.
Someone wants to know, how can VCs help their portfolio companies in emerging hubs secure additional financing from big coastal VCs?
By getting TechCrunch coverage. I joke, but I think it's a serious point, right? Where it's hard to stand out with all the different startups in a certain space, and I think if you can help your companies become known by people that get a lot of eyeballs sort of looking at their pages, I think that makes a big difference. I think, frankly, especially for these international companies that, in many cases, English isn't their first language. Getting that first coverage that makes you sort of known in the valley, or at least known among investing circles, can make a big difference.
I think for us, this is one area that we pride ourselves on at M25, is that we are, ideally your most sophisticated first check, leading your pre-seed or seed round, and having that connectivity based in Chicago, but the relationships with coastal firms that are the ideal raise for your Series A or Series B. I think, whether you're in an international market or a secondary U.S. market, choosing a pre-seed investor that actually can help you support your fundraising journey can be really helpful with that.
Yeah, for us, we help out our founders a lot with their fundraise. Because we only write 50K checks, we know that most people want to raise more money than 50K. And so we actually spend a lot of time at our firm getting to know all these investors, whether it's here locally, where I live, or even elsewhere in the US, and trying to really understand what do all these people like and dislike, what is their stage, et cetera, what is their model, and then do introductions appropriately. But I think even ahead of that, especially for international companies, we often get involved in helping with their storytelling, because especially at the pre-seed, I can't actually think of many companies where I was impressed with their pre-seed deck. That doesn't stop us from investing, but I think as you go along, your deck has to be a better and better story. And so that is something that we also spend a lot of cycles on, that a lot of founders don't even think about. Like, how do you not only make the story sound good, but how do you make the story sound unique? Because we see a lot of companies, we know what stories are not unique, and we know what stories may possibly have an angle that is unique that will capture interest of investors. And so that, I think, is a really key thing that founders don't get to see, because you're not seeing all the other startups who are doing the exact same thing as you.
Yeah.
Someone said, tell Elizabeth I love hippocorns.
Thank you.
And they also added, speaking of, what is the best way to use Twitter to fundraise efficiently? I think you kind of touched on that a little bit, but.
I do have stickers if anyone wants them, our new hippocorns. But I think for Twitter, actually, a lot of firms, as I kind of alluded to these days, have online processes. In fact, 15% of our portfolio has come in completely cold, meaning they didn't come from an accelerator or a founder in our portfolio or a VC friend or whatever. They just came in direct. But we're not unique to that, right? Like, you can pretty much ping any investor on Twitter, Rare Breed, The Fund, 2048, all of these firms, A4, Unshackled, all of these firms, you can find them on Twitter. You can ping them on Twitter. That is the nice thing. A lot of these VCs have open DMs, or they have web pages telling you exactly how to submit your company, and they do take a look. So it is a lot more open and accessible than things were 5 to 10 years ago. I think that the biggest bottleneck actually is doing the research and figuring out who are you going to target and how are you going to get your deck there.
And one last question. Silicon Valley investors offer better valuations than New York. If location isn't as critical given Zoom and online, why shouldn't founders just target Silicon Valley investors? Rich, do you have a thought on that?
If I heard the question, I think why should outside of the market companies target Silicon Valley investors?
Well, I guess the idea is that like if Silicon Valley gives better valuations than New York, why shouldn't people just come to Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I think valuation is certainly a factor, and so if I'm a founder, I want to get the most capital with the least dilution. So to the degree that Silicon Valley investors are willing to pay that, that's certainly a good reason. I think the reality, though, is, hey, it's a long journey to ultimately build a truly successful, truly sustainable company, and you should go for wherever the best mentorship, as Elizabeth was saying, or advice or coaching, wherever the best coaching and advice is. I think that's the best place to go. It turns out, for historical reasons, although this will change over the course of time, but for historical reasons, the most number of reps, the most number of mistakes and successes have historically occurred out of these, the coastal VCs, just because they've been in the business the longest. But I think those are probably the couple reasons to consider it.
Do either of you have thoughts?
I would just add that, oftentimes you have to look at the incentives and the motivations behind anything. And if you're taking money from a Silicon Valley investor that's giving you the best valuation in the world, but on a check that they frankly don't care about, then that might indicate the likelihood of them actually breaking their neck to go help you be successful in your company versus a pre-seed or seed stage firm in your own backyard that's like, I'm an emerging manager, my career is on the line for this company, I will be with you, through good times and bad. I think there's a lot of reasons to think about how to optimize for the right partner. But I also think that there's a onus on local investors to match what's market and not just try to compete and win based on a lack of capital in their ecosystem.
I guess last thought, I would just run a process, right? Like if the New York investors, if you get a competing offer from Silicon Valley, you should take that to your local investors and see, if they can match it or do better. Like ultimately, that's what this is about. This is a market, and you want to try to make this market as efficient as possible.
And thank you. That is all we have time for today, so thank you, everyone.
Thank you.